Hi, everyone. I'm Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Truro University, and welcome to the FOLCS Conversation series. It's also a part of the 92Y Talk series and the Newmark Civic Life series on pro-democracy. FOLCS and the 92Y Talk series, we've been partners for decades, and we oftentimes join in together on very important subjects. Both 92Y and FOLCS were dedicated to making ideas entertaining and smart. And we have a wonderful discussion today on the a conversation on the presidential election and the lessons that we've learned. We've given it not quite a month's time for the information to digest. We have three superstars here to help us look critically at the data and some questions that arose from the election. We have Mark Penn, who many of you know is a public relations savant, a guru. He's been a political strategist for many decades. And you may remember that years ago, he was in the White House for 6 years in the Clinton administration as the pollster for the White House, and has been responsible for a lot of polling and other marketing techniques in elections. That's Mark Penn. Hey, Mark, welcome. Thank you. We have Allan Lichtman, who is a distinguished longtime historian and professor, the author of over 10 books, award-winning books. He's written a biography of FDR. He's written a book about elections and voting patterns, and he's been an excellent forecaster of elections, with created his own political modeling on factors that can be used to assess and predict elections. That's Allan Lichtman. Allan, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And of course, Liz Mair, who is known, among other things, as a Republican political strategist and an online media specialist and social media specialist. And in this world, that is incredibly important. You've seen her on all sorts of programs like MSNBC and even Bill Maher's Real Time. And she worked for the McCain campaign, presidential campaign, in part working on what was at the time, I think, pretty novel ideas about how to use an online service for marketing and social media. Liz Mair. Liz, thank you for
Thank
joining
you.
us. Lovely seeing you.
Likewise.
Let's start with a simple question. You can all answer it if you wish, and we can move on to other questions. What most surprised you about the election? All three of you gave it a lot of thought beforehand. Is there anything that in particular surprised you? So any one of you can jump in and start.
I'm happy to start.
Thanks, Liz.
One thing that surprised me, and I know there's been a bit of criticism about these exit polls, but I'm just relying on the NBC exit poll data. One thing that surprised me was the extent to which Native Americans appeared to swing towards Trump, or at least, if they didn't swing towards Trump, at least swung away from Harris and away from Democrats. And I'm sure that the data there is very locality specific, but just to pull out two things that are verifiable based on the county voting numbers. When you look at Arizona and you look at Apache County in particular, which sits on the Navajo reservation, but it's not the white part of the Navajo reservation, really. That's more ironically Navajo County. You actually do see that there was a huge drop in the amount of support for Harris there, which does explain part of how she ended up not being capable of winning Arizona. Also, if you look at North Carolina, Trump has had a longstanding association with the Lumbee tribe there, has committed to providing them with full federal recognition, actually going back to his 2016 campaign. I'm not quite sure why that didn't happen in his first administration, but whatever. If you look at the proportions there, again, very, very strongly pro-Trump, although that part of North Carolina doesn't have very high turnout. So that was one thing that I wasn't expecting to see. It's not surprising if we think that the election was mostly about inflation and people's concerns about cost of living crisis. Native Americans are the poorest Americans in general. You have to think that if little old me was pissed off about the price of eggs at any point in the last 4 years, God knows anybody who's living on a reservation or who is just in a much poorer demographic certainly would have been. So perhaps that makes sense, but it wasn't something I was necessarily expecting to see in the numbers, particularly when we looked at Arizona and the Navajo reservation, because the Navajo have sort of had this perception traditionally that they do lean more left. And it looked like that changed a little.
So, but that's an interesting question. I'll let you both jump in on that as well. But it does seem as if lots of groups, not just that was an original thought, Liz. I had never even considered that. But lots of
Here to
ethnic,
help.
no, it was a very original thought. I had not read that or seen that. But it does seem like racially, ethnically, that the groups went a little off ramp. Americans, I think historically, and again, I think Allan could speak to this, tend to stick with their party. You know, what's the joke about American Jews, that they live like Protestants but vote like Puerto Ricans? You know, and as if there was always 80% of Jews voted for the Democratic Party. I don't know exactly what those final numbers are, but it does seem like even with Barack Obama putting on a pep rally for African American men, that didn't work in this instance. Hispanics seem to be pulling towards Trump. I don't know if that's an immigration issue, but in my lifetime, and again, you're experts, it does seem like groups, individual groups, ethnic groups, racial groups went off ramp in ways that we've not seen before. Anyway, Mark, Allan, do you want to add to any of this?
Well, let me jump in, because the first thing I want to kind of emphasize is that politics doesn't really stay the same.
Really?
California was Republican before it was Democratic. Texas was Democratic before it was Republican. Blacks voted for Republicans before they voted for Democrats. This idea that the system is immutably predictable and unchanged according to some demographic or identity groups that will last in the next 20 or 40 years it just doesn't actually hold water, because the parties reinvent themselves to get back into power. They create new coalitions, new issues come up. The question is whether or not people are operating rationally in their interests, or are they operating as part of a group or identity politics? And I think the most interesting thing about this election is that I think it was a reassertion of kind of voting on issues as opposed to identity. And that was really most remarkably seen in what is virtually a 20-point shift among the Latino community, which does not have a long history of voting in elections. When I was doing things in '96, they were about 1 or 2%. Now they're 13%. And if they continue to register, they're already bigger than the Black community. And the Asian community similarly showed significant shifts. But did they do so as Asians and Latinos, or did they do so as working class and middle class voters who voted their pocketbook in this election? And I think the second is really true, that they don't want to be marketed to and voted by as on their identity. They want to be individuals voting according to issues and how they affect their lives. And I think that's the most interesting thing out of this.
So that's ironic, actually, Mark, because we're living in the age of the politics of identity. And what you're saying is that that idea was ultimately defeated at the ballot box because people did not vote their identity. In many ways, this was a very favorable outcome if you believe that people should vote in their interests, whether economic or other interests that they identify, as opposed to saying, here's what people expect me to do because I'm African American, and here's what people expect me to do because I'm a Democrat. And in fact, I'm a free agent. I'm prepared to vote any way I wish based on my own preferences. Allan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. First of all, it's not true that ethnic or racial groups vote on their identity. I've done a lot of studies on
And you're
this.
saying that was never true. Is that true?
Never true. They're always voting on their interests, what they believe to be in the best interest of their community. And the movement of African Americans in this election is way overstated. Only 13% of African Americans. Again, I take the comments about taking the exit polls with a grain of salt very seriously from our smart people who do polls. But it's only 13%. It was 11% in 2020. it's much more significant, as Mark accurately points out, for the Hispanic community, which is now surpassed slightly the African
So
American.
then what did Trump pick up? You know, because what Mark is suggesting, and I think is saying, well, look, that's a large percentage of Americans now are the Hispanic Americans. What was it? Because what I'm curious about is why was the polling so off?
I want to comment on the polling.
Yeah.
We don't know yet. It's going to take a while to figure out why, if we ever can do. And the question is, will it last, or is this just a blip? You got to be really careful as a historian. I always take the long view, and you never know whether what happens in an individual election is a blip. But what struck me was the fixation of the media with the polls. And I think that was absolutely pernicious. Look, I'm old. I go back to Kennedy Nixon. I remember it well. I saw JFK in New York City when I was 13, and he blew us away. You know, he was incredibly charismatic, an amazing figure. We had a poll once every couple of weeks and nobody cared. Now we have a poll every couple of hours and the media jumps on it as though it's a revelation.
Allan, let me just interrupt you and ask you this, because you just made me think of this. Do we, what was the polling in 1960?
Dead even, as the election was pretty much dead even. But my point is, they're treating these polls as though they're gospel. You know, a 1% change, which is well within the noise. The media says, oh, you know, Trump has leaped out ahead, or Harris is now 4 points ahead. And the point is, it was all noise. All the polls are in the margin of error. And yet the media spent vastly more time on the polls, obsessed with them, than they did on providing us reliable information about the election or explaining the consequences.
Okay, but here's a question for all three of you. Is there evidence that polling actually influences elections? And if that's true, given the fact that the legacy media is very partisan nowadays, you know, I always like to point out, I'm of a certain age, that I never knew what Walter Cronkite's party affiliation was. I don't think anyone did. That was just how people heard the news in that era. And now we know we turn in echo chambers to certain cable stations to tell us exactly the way we want to hear it, in the manner in which we want to hear it. So then you think, well, then there's a lot of cynicism about polling, because if I'm with a particular cable station, I'm going to deliver the poll that thinks it will get the audience cynically to manipulate my audience. Is that fair to suggest that polling actually does influence elections, and that's why the legacy media actually favored some polls over others?
I don't think polls direct.
Let's just try. Let's get.
I just don't think polls directly influence how people vote, but they have a profound effect, as I explained, and a pernicious effect on how the media, including the mainstream media,
right? But all I'm saying
is, which then in turn influences voting, because there's no way of countering the disinformation.
But Allan, then that means that they do influence elections, because
indirectly,
they're being used by entities that are designed to change the election, and it's used as a tool. Liz?
Yeah, I think I think generally I agree with what Allan was saying there, but I also, while being extraordinarily loath to criticize the media because I have to work with them in order to make it function.
You're on their shows all the time.
Just being candid. What I've observed when I have worked on races is a couple of things. First of all, California needs to be set aside from the rest of the country when it comes to how people respond to polls, because California is the one state that I've worked in where really whoever is ahead in the polls, you have a lot of people who wait until whenever they cast their ballot. I was going to say election day, but obviously that's sort of a running period.
Yeah, nowadays, right.
But you do have more of a trend that I've seen in California where people, when they go to cast their ballot, they do seem to go with whoever's ahead in the polls. Which I always think is interesting, because when you've got an incumbent who's ahead in the polls and it's sort of a change election, to me, I would think, okay, as a voter, I would be more inclined to go, oh, well, that person's ahead. Wow, I better cast my vote for the other person. But that's not what seems to happen in California. So I just want to set that aside. I think also this cycle, what we saw, I'm not saying we see it every cycle, but I think this cycle and in 2020 and also in 2016, so basically the Trump era, what we've seen is I think a lot of Democrats and non-Democratic voters who are going to vote for the Democratic nominee have used polls that show their candidate, I mean, literally, as Allan says, they could be 0.3% ahead, but the poll makes it look like they're ahead, whatever. They use that as sort of a way of shoring up emotional support and convincing themselves that things are going to be okay.
Wait, you're saying they're doing it also for themselves?
Oh, I'm not even saying the media. I'm saying normal voters.
Yeah, right. People are saying it's like a confirmation bias, right?
Right. Like I will not name check particular family members, but one particular family member, in all of those 3 elections, there was a lot of every time a poll came out showing the Democrat ahead, like, oh, it's okay, we're going to be fine. We're going to be fine. We don't have to do as much. And I was like, I don't know, because the problem is in the era of Trump, there are a lot of people who see those polls for Trump. And even though we've had a problem in the Trump era of polling understating Trump's support, the way that I see Trump voters respond to that is saying, oh my God, they're 0.3 ahead. We better go eke out an extra 2 or 3%. And then they do it. And then everybody's like, oh my God. So, in 2016, you get the Hillary loss. This year, you get the Harris loss. In 2020, a lot of people that I know who are the sort of Democrats who are like, oh, we're ahead in the polls. It's comfortable. We're fine. We're really surprised by how close the margins were in some places. Whereas I think most of us who, if you just pulled up the polling snapshot and assumed that the polling had been done roughly correctly, wouldn't really have been surprised by any of those results at all, right? So I think I do think they have some effect, but I don't think most voters, when they're making a decision, I think, when you're looking at African-American men, I think a lot of African-American men are just like, dude, I was just better off 4 years ago. Like I just was. And at the end of the day, I'm being asked to choose between what's now and what was then. And I'm going to go with what's then. And like Allan says, it wasn't even a huge shift, but it was enough that it mattered in some places. And I think with Hispanic voters, who I'm personally much more familiar with, I live in a majority Hispanic neighborhood. I hear a ton of the commentary, like every time we go to like get a coffee at the donut shop, whatever. I think with Hispanic voters, there was much more of a focus on opportunity issues and the fact that they felt like Democrats were speaking to all these other things, but not the core, like, my husband needs more hours building houses. Like, what is going on there? Or, I don't feel like my kids are doing as well in school and they're not being pushed as hard, and my kids aren't necessarily going to end up with a vastly better life than me and my husband do. And so I think that matters significantly more than polling. But I think the polling matters a little bit with some people. I think it probably, if you're looking at level of volunteer enthusiasm, which I think really matters, particularly when you're looking at like how Trump eked out a win in Pennsylvania, where the early vote numbers looked pretty good for Harris. And if you're looking at how Democratic volunteer operations, from what I heard, were just pretty lackluster. Like they had like 1 week after she was announced where it went gangbusters. And after that, not a lot of people were coming in and chasing out.
But do people like you and Mark,
polling matters there?
But when people like you and Mark hear that, is that the kind of data point, Mark? I'm curious, when you were in the White House, what Liz just said, like, just enthusiasm. I'm trying to understand, what data points, like for instance, later maybe we'll talk about the betting markets, which I think are interesting, that we've never heard before, and the betting markets now. And it seems to me, well, bettors actually in football, they want to know what the wind conditions are going to look like, who's hurt, right? And I'm saying what Liz just said about, well, people didn't get really great volunteer work. That's a data point that we should factor into an analysis. And I'm wondering, Mark, has that always been true? Or is it simply you make a phone call? Because I didn't learn, getting ready for this, I learned that apparently phone calls, well, first of all, I have a board chair, Jeff Lenoble, who says, he's of roughly my age, and he said he's never been called and he's never met anyone who has ever been called. And apparently the phone calls only get a 2% response rate. And here's something that I heard or read, that educated women are more likely to pick up the phone and answer. And that explains why abortion seemed like a bigger issue. I read that somewhere, somebody gave that analysis that shows you how that got skewed. So it just makes you think, and then it says, well, on the online polling, and that's something Liz knows something about, you get a lot of people that work at home and who are younger. And so that has a whole different demographic. So I'm wondering, Mark, what are the data points? How do you evaluate this data, and from a pollster's perspective before actually issuing out? It can't just be crafting a question in a clever way and hoping to get a particular response.
All right, well, there's so many questions out there.
Yeah.
So first, let me go back to the effective polls in a campaign. There is what I call the campaign and the campaign about the campaign. Okay. The actual campaign is the campaign about abortion, inflation, crime, leadership capabilities, foreign affairs, Israel. That's the actual campaign. The campaign about the campaign is who's raising money, who's ahead in the polls, whose staff has said, has quit, is fired, is whatnot. Okay. And the actual campaign matters about 90%. And the press tends to cover about 90% the campaign about the campaign, which matters maybe 10%. Okay. And you have to put that in perspective, that's what the press finds interesting, and that moves around. And the actual campaign, the press doesn't find interesting. Nobody wants to write an in-depth article about what happened to the price of eggs and why. Okay. And so let me just say that's why. And yeah, look, and do these polls and things matter? On the extremes, they do. If, for example, we tell you your candidate's going to lose by 20 points, you might not show up. But for most polls in most situations, they really don't matter at all, and the voters just kind of find it interesting. But in the extremes, they do, or if I'm completely outraged. So then I think the second thing is polls should not be disbanded or disregarded on this election. One of our polls that we have here at the company I run, Stagwell, is the Harris poll, and we got 5 out of 7 states right for Trump. Didn't get all 7, but they were all pretty close. And personally, I wrote an article 2 weeks out in which I said, look, Trump has the edge, and here are the reasons why. And when you look at these polls, people have to stop looking at the horse race as though that is the poll. That is not the poll. That is the dependent variable, not the independent variable. Okay. And what you're really looking for is, are people happy or unhappy? Do they approve of the president or not? Do they like the candidates or not? What are their top issues and who's winning? Okay. And then how are the campaigns doing at communicating their message? And what I saw, at that time was people were unhappy. They actually both liked Harris and Trump, surprisingly, almost equally, about 47% liking them both, which was remarkable because back in 2016, everybody hated Trump and hated Hillary. The issues mostly favored Trump. And then we'll get to talk about it. There was a mail vote, MAIL vote advantage, which the Republicans had eliminated. And then finally, I pointed out that when you asked Blacks about the economy, they said it was good. And when you asked Latinos about the economy, they said it was bad. And that meant to me that we were likely to see a Latino shift. Mm-hmm. That question really indicated how they were going to vote.
So Allan, I know that I think he discounted, in his view, the Hispanic swing. But I'm interested in something Allan said earlier that I hope the 3 of you will address: the legacy media, because I think he used the word pernicious, which is a very good word to describe if you're saying that this kind of manipulation of the media. And I'm wondering have we reached a point where the American public has grown so cynical of the legacy media because of their partisan nature Or is there still a lot of confidence? In other words, is this resulted in a shift? Did this election do anything to give people either a better or worse impression of the news that they're either digesting because they felt that they were not actually getting the news, or they're saying, well, look, I vote for the blue and I stayed on the blue team, and MSNBC was the blue team and Fox News and Newsmax was the red team. And, I don't have any problem with that, as opposed to saying, you know what, it would be great if there was just something called the news.
Yeah, I have called this the disinformation election. We've always had disinformation, but we have never seen such an explosion of disinformation, largely coming from the right. And there have been studies on this. People don't longer get their news from the New York Times or CNN. They get it primarily from all kinds of social media outlets, and it very heavily leans to the right. And then something brand new happened here, and that is a 300 billion millionaire put his thumb on the scales. Elon Musk is worth more than the GDP of most countries in the world. He controls X, formerly Twitter. I have read reports that billions upon billions of viewers have seen this disinformation, and it pervades every single issue. Yes, I understand the inflation, but again, Mark is right. Look at not the horse race, but the surveys is what people say, and they are affected by, it's not their fault. They're not fact checkers. They think the stock market is tanked, that unemployment is at a record high, that jobs are collapsing, that real wages are in a tank. All of that false. Or look at the immigration issue. They think these undocumented immigrants are these bloodthirsty killers. In fact, undocumented immigrants are the most law-abiding segment of our society, committing crimes, including violent crimes, less than half the rate of native-born Americans. They contribute enormously to taxation. They're the mainstay of the agricultural, construction, personal service, hospitality industries. But the disinformation is pervasive, and it comes from not from news sources. And this is why mainstream media's fixation on polls is so pernicious. They're looking at all these polls which are in noise and not speaking truth to power, which is what I always thought was their role. Plus, we now see the mainstream media being taken over by the billionaires. Los Angeles Times, Washington Post. Elon Musk is talking about buying MSNBC the way
Right.
he bought Twitter. When I was a kid, I consumed science fiction. And one of the themes of science fiction, this was science fiction, was that a few people would become so wealthy that they could exercise inordinate control over society. And we're not far from that.
And you're saying we're there. Liz, you probably have some.
Not quite, but we're getting there.
Liz, you probably have some interesting things to say about this because you are an online and social media specialist. I don't know whether you think that the accessibility and democratization of what information is provided on social media is a bad thing. I wonder whether you think it actually counteracts the legacy media, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
I think it can. One thing that I would say that I think is persistently interesting to me when I am going through and thinking for the purposes of me setting client strategy, what do we need to be doing in terms of media relations? One of the things that I do think is really interesting is survey after survey that I see, public, private, and Mark can probably speak to this too, because I'm sure he sees a lot of the same things, show that, yeah, overall, Americans' trust in media has declined. But the place where it really hasn't declined is local news. People still trust, their local 6 p.m. news or their local 10 p.m. news or their local paper. Now, one of the things that I do think is a really serious issue that is going to confront America, and I don't think it's necessarily to the benefit or detriment of either party or any particular philosophical persuasion, I just think it's not good for us all, is that we have seen a pretty steep fall off in how local news is surviving in the media era. A lot of that is attributed to sort of tech giants and their influence, and particularly the way that the advertising money flows. I think that's a lot less of the issue. What I see that really concerns me is I see a lot more local media that for many, many years now has been getting away from doing more investigative stories and more hard reporting, and a lot more into sort of like rewriting the same content or syndicating stuff. And I think that's not good. If I were a billionaire who owned several, local media outlets, I would be heavily investing in the investigative stuff because, frankly, I think that's what gets eyeballs. I think people
Right.
like the dirt. I think people like what's interesting and where, the press is holding people to account. Like, the popular stuff that people always see on the 6 p.m. news. It's always the like on your side investigation of whatever's going, right? Like that's the stuff people really like. And that's
Yeah.
where I would think that you would be doing the best in terms of selling your advertising and maintaining subscriptions, right? So that's as far as I'll go in terms of criticizing the media, except just to say, I think that there have been some decisions made in terms of where content should go that doesn't actually match what the audience wants. And I think there's a better way to align all of that and make that work better financially for media, but it hasn't happened. So I think what you have as a result is because you have somewhat weakened local media that isn't focusing as much on sort of the core things that I think people care about, which are going to be investigating things, holding bad guys to account, and frankly, local sports and weather, right? That's what people care about. Because you've had less of that, I think you've had more people who have tended to filter up to sort of the national sources, whether that be cable news, which, my major criticism of cable news is everything's got to be done in, fast tidbits, which means
They don't do what we're doing here.
Right. It's not easy to get below sort of the top line. You've got 5 people sitting there. You've got 5 minutes. Do the math, right? It's also difficult because I think you tend to have a lot of people at cable news, and I'm totally not knocking younger people. There are some fantastic, like 24-year-old reporters out there, but you also do have a lot of people who, because they're 24-year-old reporters, they totally don't remember the 2012 election, right? So when they're sort of being asked to do a compare and a contrast and look at where voters have been historically, it's like, somebody's going, huh, wow, what do I remember from when I was in 3rd grade? Like, I mean, it might not be.
Well, wait a minute. Hold on a second. Allan was back. He was 13.
Well,
and he told us he was
1960.
I know, but he was very alert.
I mean,
Allan Lichtman was very alert in
analysis.
1960.
It was very brilliant. Very brilliant, Liz.
Well, so
Liz, and I think it's a great point, Liz.
Well, so I mean, I was a much more politically attuned youngster, and obviously my kid growing up in my house is a much more politically attuned youngster. There are exceptions, right? Like, I think when we go and we look at, Tim Russert, when Luke Russert came on the scene in 2008, I remember so many people were like, what is this guy doing here? He's a kid. What does he know? And I was like, well, I don't know, probably living in a house with Tim Russert. I'm going to guess he actually knows quite a lot.
Pretty good.
Potentially quite a lot more than a lot of the 35-year-olds on air who are complaining about him getting the same airtime. So I don't want to paint a broad brush, but I do think we have some issues within the media ecosystem that means that, like, if you're watching CNN at 6:30 in the morning and you've only got that 30 minutes, which, by the way, already is 6 times more than anybody else in the rest of the world has got. Right. That's the other thing we forget. Nobody's got time for this stuff. Everybody who's watching this does because you care. Most people are like, oh my God, I've got to get to work. I've got to get gas. I've got, whatever. Right. I think you're getting not necessarily the full picture that you would want to fully understand what's going on out there.
And there are less venues for that.
That's not really CNN's fault. I will say just quickly on the point about social media. Yeah, I actually do think that definitely more online media, what we used to call blogs, what I used to deal with, and what I now just refer to as ideological media, which can drift into influencers and social media content. I actually don't think that that's necessarily bad stuff, but it does require an ability to parse things. And what I do notice a lot is that with people who are senior citizens, no offense, I know I'm not, this is not a comment about Allan. But when I'm thinking about, we all have the family member who's like pretty dyed in the wool and pretty set in their philosophical opinions. And suddenly they start encountering like YouTube or Twitter, or they see stuff pop up on Facebook. they aren't always necessarily totally sure what's legit. And then the fact that we have had some mainstream media screw ups just contributes to that also.
Right.
And so, do I think social media is the problem? No, I actually think that people doing more of these sort of startup initiatives, actually, I think is often a very important corrective to a lot of other stuff that's getting on. But I think if you're 78 years old, trying to parse through that and figure out what you like, what you don't like, what's legit, who's really good at digging into things, who's just going to do like the
And also TikTok, like you're
Sure.
saying, you would say even within the family of social media, there's stuff that you should be reading as opposed to stuff that you should not be relying upon, as opposed to, you probably can say, Thane, I can give you 100 things that you on social media or on online that would be phenomenally informative and better than anything else, but there would be other stuff that would be toxic.
Yeah.
One last.
And I can put in both of those categories of useful and phenomenally toxic and pointless.
Yeah.
It is not like an ideological divide. I could sit here if we had 2 hours and I could name off every single thing and what goes in which category and provide people with a cheat sheet.
Wow.
It's tough because there's just more going on out there.
Yeah.
Like democratization of media is wonderful in many respects, but it's tougher for people who, like you say, going back to your original point about Walter Cronkite, if you're a person who grew up watching Walter Cronkite, you just watched Walter Cronkite. Like what he said was good. Now you're like, oh my God, there are 100 million people. I don't know, right?
We trusted no, it was, hey, Liz, it was a third of the country. A third of the country every night. Think about that. There was no cable. There was no internet. Everyone sat down and a third of the country watched Walter Cronkite. One last thing before I get to Mark, we had Andrew Yang once on our show, 92Y Talks and FOLCS Conversation. And he actually said, and I think it was in his last book, he thought that the deterioration of local media is a real problem politically. That not having local newspapers, not having local, that itself has had a lot to do with what I think that Allan would say is the misinformation, relying on the legacy media and not getting it earlier. Mark, I want to jump into a tougher category, but an interesting one. The debates or the non-debates, the lack of a Democratic convention, the assassination attempts. Huge difference in this election. Is it overestimated? Would it have made a difference had there been a convention? Would it have made a difference had there been a second debate? Did the image of Trump with being shot in the ear, screaming, fight, 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 was that when the election was over? Or was that something that really wasn't a big deal, could have been easily overcome? What do you think? Those are three different categories.
Well, those are great, but I really have to go back and join this whole media.
Go ahead, sure.
And I'll come back to that. And I did run a series on the media. I run a monthly poll, the Harvard Caps Harris poll, and we looked at the media, and basically, when it comes to the mainstream media, Democrats were happy, Republicans not. And so really, you have to draw your own conclusion about who's got the misinformation and who doesn't.
Wait, I'm sorry, Mark. Are you saying that for many people, they don't think they're receiving misinformation at all?
Well, various people are unhappy with if you kind of look at what you would consider to be the mainstream media, and you ask people, are they happy with the way that the fairness that it reflected the coverage in the election? You would find Democrats were very happy and Republicans were very unhappy. So that tells you more or less what you need to know, because you would expect, if the mainstream media were covering things in a balanced way, it would that actually Democrats and Republicans would be equally happy or equally unhappy.
But Mark, wouldn't Republicans think, or conservatives think, that Fox News actually is something they should be happy about, or Newsmax?
Well, I put Fox News. Some of those.
You're not putting them in mainstream media.
No, I'm not putting them in media. I'm putting in that we would consider the three networks. And CNN.
I see. Okay. The
whether
New
you
York
want to
Times, the
include,
Washington Post.
you know, what you would consider the traditional mainstream media has lost touch with anyone with half the country, that half that considers themselves Republicans. And, you know, I will also go back to about information or misinformation, kind of something I observed when I was in the 2008 campaign, and I've developed since as a theory, and that's the theory of impressionable elites. So a lot of people would come up to me and say, if only Hillary would be a little bit more likable, I would vote for her. That was usually a college graduate or PhD. Then if somebody would come up to me and say, you know, the problem really is that Hillary's plan is too much about coverage and not enough about keeping, you know, premium prices down, middle class voter. So what's wrong with that picture? Okay. The expectation was always that college educated people would ask sophisticated policy questions. Instead, the elites have become easily swayable on the basis of things that are not substantive because they do not live the problems. Whereas the people who actually go to the grocery store, actually pay the healthcare premiums, actually have to wait in line, they don't vote on the basis of what the media tells them. They vote on how their life is lived. And that is a fundamental difference. And that is why, very interestingly, Harris won those over 100,000 and she won those under 30,000 who rely primarily on government programs. And she lost everyone in between. And those are the working and middle class voters. And no matter what people think about jobs were good, et cetera, they focused on the wage inflation gap as they experienced it in their lives.
But doesn't that reinforce this whole idea of the coastal elites just simply being, you know, out of touch? You know, there's
They are.
right. I'm saying there's this whole narrative of the, you know, the world changed, at least I think so, and I'm not a pro, I'm an amateur, that I thought the deplorables comment, you know, it's amazing how many years have gone by, but it still lives with us, right? That there's evidence of that. And that with the picking of J.D. Vance and the Appalachians and the Republican convention seemed like the first set of a consolidated attack against the coastal elites that just don't know what's going on in the world.
Well, whether it's an attack or not, because I want to put that aside, because everybody kind of comes in here with their ideological lens. The truth is, people making over 100,000 are voting on what they read, and people who are making under 100,000 are voting on what they experience. Okay,
I've got to jump in here.
That's a very important distinction here, and it's a very important distinction that I've seen over time, and that's where the disconnect really comes in between the elites and the college educated and the non-college educated here, and how they've consistently changed now how they're voting, and it really does actually go back to real policies that, look, when I was working with President Clinton, that we realized in retrospect tended to favor the coast over the Midwest. And that dichotomy has not been healed as of yet. The impact or the differential impact that people in those, what were the blue wall states, feel about the economy, feel about immigration and fracking and EVs and manufacturing jobs, et cetera. Those are real, okay? And policy-wise, they have not really been dealt with. And we will see whether or not this election represents a fundamental.
Allan, do you want to add to that before we jump back into this idea of the debates and the assassination attempts? And
Chris, this idea of elite has been so misrepresented, so thrown about casually. I've been called an elite because I've published 13 books. Hey, I did not inherit those books the way Donald Trump inherited millions of dollars from his dad. I produced those books by busting my tail through blood, sweat, and tears, through going through rigorous review. Yet somehow all of those labors makes me an elite, whereas billionaires,
we're all elites on
Elon
this.
Musk, let me finish. billionaires like Elon Musk and Donald Trump are somehow not elites. You know, way we
Yeah, but Mark is talking about the actual voters.
Misrepresented.
Right. He's talking about the actual rank and file voters that go to the polls, and to them, they don't write 13 books. That is a rare. That doesn't mean you don't. That doesn't mean you didn't earn it, Alan. It just
I'm
means
working as hard as they are at different labors, and I resent being called an elite. I am not. I started with nothing, and I worked my tail off to get where I am. I didn't inherit it.
okay.
And
All right.
let me close the loop here. And yet somehow billionaires like Elon Musk and Donald Trump attack people like me as elites when they have thousands of times
All right. No,
power and
and you've made
influence
that
than I do.
point. No, I get it. No, I think
Yeah, it's reprehensible.
it reinforces something that you said earlier, and that's
Yeah.
interesting. Liz, do you want to jump in on the idea of some of the things I raised, like the debate?
I'll introduce an element of humor here, just on the subject of who's an elite and who's not an elite. JD Vance and I actually have argued about this online on Twitter. And I think it's funny because, you know, at one point he was doing people like this lady. And I was like, what? He and I have almost exactly, I mean, okay, I didn't serve in the Marine Corps. He's got me there. But if you actually look at our bio, you look at what our families were like, you look at the socioeconomic circumstances in which we grew up and how we both propelled ourselves forward through education, through quite elite institutions. I think it's kind of funny because actually JD Vance is probably one of the people in politics who on a personal level I identify with the most. He and I have gone in slightly different philosophical directions, but I think that's an interesting sort of story to tell to illustrate how people who are almost exactly the same line by line on paper can both be like, hey, you elitist, you're an elitist, right? Everybody's an elitist if they're on the other side of the argument. But
can I just say something just to go back to the historical thing? Maybe Alan, there was a time when it was flipped, right? That it was the charismatic Kennedy was considered that elite, and the Republicans were more, I guess, it were Rockefeller Republicans.
Well, and FDR and even
FDR, right?
I mean,
George Washington was actually one of the richest people in the country at the time.
Right. I mean,
so you're saying, so
right.
that goes back to what Mark said earlier, that it switches back and forth.
Well, I would also argue that just in general, the way that things tend to be structured and the fact that there are some people who want to go to Congress to try to get rich, and there are definitely plenty of people who enhance their wealth while serving in Congress. But you also see quite a lot of people who have made a ton of money before they go into politics, right? You make your money first, then you use it to, you know, fund your campaign. So I don't know. I think there's plenty of elitism to be shared around. I also think that there are plenty of people who get tagged as being elites who aren't particularly elite. Like, I mean, Tim Walz did plenty to tag JD Vance as being an elitist for having gone to Yale, like whatever. I mean, I think that's a pretty ridiculous charge.
All right, let's start about some of these things. Did the debates make a difference?
Yeah, the debate. Well, I mean, obviously,
we'll come back to you, Alan. 1 second.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the first big one, the one where we all got to see exactly how much Biden had declined, made a huge difference. I mean, this one I will go ahead and check a family member. We watched that with my mother, who is in her late 70s, and who maybe voted for a Republican, maybe back when Gerald Ford was around, but probably not even then. You know, she has voted for Republicans for state and local offices, but generally speaking, presidential, like there's no question, she's pretty much always voting for Democrats. And I thought it was really interesting watching that debate. Not only were me, my husband, and my kid floored, even knowing that Biden had declined and having that information going in, floored by just how bad it was. But that was one where, I mean, even my mom, died in the will Democrat. There's no way she would vote for Donald Trump. I'm confident of that. But even she was like, wow, I don't know if this is tenable. And so, yeah, that made a big difference. I think had everybody seen what we saw in that debate earlier in the year And had Biden been forced out earlier in the year, it's possible, we're never going to know, but it's possible Harris would have won. I think having to pull together a campaign of that scale that late in the day, and also having to manage, we now know financially there was obviously a huge problem with having to keep all these Biden people around at the same time she needed to institute her own team. Huge financial problems. Huge problems in terms of basic things that need to happen on campaigns, like the approval process. I mean, when I'm hearing stories from Democrats that they couldn't even get a tweet issued without Jen O'Malley Dillon signing off on the language of the tweet, I'm not terribly surprised. Maybe she didn't win, right? So yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think these things did matter. I don't think the lack of a primary, personally, I don't think that mattered. I think that that's a really nice argument that a lot of people who were going to back Trump no matter what tend to like to use to troll Democrats. You're supposed to be the Democratic Party. You didn't even have a primary. Well, whatever. I mean, that's kind of how parties function at the end of the day, right? If you go back and you look at 2016 and the floor action, there's plenty of stuff that didn't look particularly Democratic that the Trump guys did to ram through that nomination and ensure it took effect. So, this is how the world works. But I do think all of those things, yeah, ultimately, did they matter? They did. The primaries is the one part that I would leave out, because I don't think if they had an open primary and you'd had, I don't know, even 2 weeks of Democrats squabbling and killing each other, I think it would have been much worse for the party than what happened. I think they did about the best they could.
1 second, Alan. I just want to ask Mark one thing to fit this.
No problem.
Just one quick question. Mark, so you were in the White House for 6 years. So I'm just curious, when you watched how things were being handled with either Biden's age and difficulties that he was experiencing, and then what seemed like the overmanagement of Kamala Harris in her campaign, for a guy who's seasoned in watching those things unfold, was this just not handled right on both ends? I mean, should this have been handled?
Both of them made strategic decisions that they implemented and were implementing. The strategic decision of Biden and his team members was to protect Biden at all costs. And that's what they implemented. And somebody had this crazy idea of doing a debate before he got the nomination, which was a crazy idea, which I pointed out the vulnerability at the time for that idea. And I don't know.
But why would they have done that knowing what they had? They knew that
we were going to have to wait for the books to come out, and everyone will tell their fake stories. And maybe we will figure out what the reality was of how that, because their prior strategy had been guard him at all costs.
Exactly.
And they implemented that up until that day. And on the Harris point of view, they adopted, and Harris included, a similar strategy of guard her and her offhand comments at all costs, no matter how bad it looks. And that, of course, ultimately was the biggest weakness of the campaign, we believe, but maybe it was the biggest strength, because we really don't know. I'm waiting to get the CBS transcript to see what will CBS ever release that transcript, and why not? It's so unusual for a news organization not to release a transcript of an interview that they did. So these campaigns, and the Harris campaign, remember, it's only 1.6%. Okay. It was a very close election. It was not a disastrous campaign. It was not a landslide. It was not like when I did Clinton against Dole. It was not, an 8-point blowout, by any stretch of the imagination. So either person could have won, but the things that had to be overcome here are inflation, the poor Biden ratings, the direction that people felt the country was going was the wrong one. There were fundamental underlying issues here, which the Harris campaign was not going to address as a question of strategy. They were going to ignore them and thought they could get through on just blasting Trump. But Trump was not the Trump of 2016 with a 35% favorable. He was somebody, as you pointed out, who survived an assassination attempt with an iconic photo of "I'm going to fight, fight, fight." And that's the kind of thing that your average voter kind of likes.
Yeah. Alan?
Yes, thank you. I like to call myself an equal opportunity analyst, so I'm going to offend everyone. I have summarized American politics for a very long time in one sentence. Republicans have no principles, Democrats have no spine. And that was absolutely in neon lights on display in this campaign. I was deeply critical at the time, not after the fact, of the spineless Democrats for openly, viciously, right out in public, trashing their elected president and their elected nominee. I have never before seen such a spineless public display, and I've studied American politics, as you know, since the founding. I think that inevitably tainted any Democratic nominee if the own party is tearing itself apart. And by the way, to listen to the Democrats, the spineless Democrats, and the media, you would think 0% of the American people thought Biden won that debate. Well, 33% thought he won that debate, comparable to the percentage that thought Trump won the debate against Harris, and way better than Barack Obama's disastrous first debate against Mitt Romney.
Romney, yeah.
Percent thought. Now, spineless Democrats, the principleless Republicans, they could not have cared less about all the indications of Trump's decline, confusing Nancy Pelosi and Nikki Haley, not knowing what city he's in, not knowing the name of his doctor, calling Elon Musk Leon, ranting incoherently and crazily about Arnold Palmer's penis, about the late, great Hannibal Lecter, about whether you would want to be electrocuted by a shark or killed by a shark or electrocution. If Biden had done that, the Democrats again would have been all over him. They couldn't have cared less about Trump saying, I'm going to use the military against American citizens. I'm going to throw in jail my political opponents. I'm going to suspend the Constitution if that's what it takes. Not one blink of the eye from any Republican about any of this with respect to Donald Trump. But the first time of trouble, right out in public, the spineless Democrats trash their president. Both sides are hardly covered with glory here.
For all the criticisms that people had about the election, and again, you're right, all of you said, let's wait, there's going to be more books written about this.
Oh, yeah.
You're all astute and aware of the world. Is there any country, democratic country, that handles elections better than we do? And again, we have to go past the fact that we have, two houses of Congress as opposed to a parliament. That makes a big difference, that we have elections. You don't call for elections every 4 years. But in terms of the voting process, there are people that are saying, well, Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution says that every state gets to their state legislatures decide what the time, place, and manner for election rules are. So we have 50 states that could, in theory, have different election rules. And so that we see battleground states, Pennsylvania, people were just saying, well, we should count the ballots even if the ballots, weren't signed properly or if they had some defects in them. And so I think people lose confidence in the system, saying, well, shouldn't there just be a uniform voting system? Well, that's not what the founding fathers said. The founding fathers said that, that the state legislatures make those calls. So I'm wondering, are we being overly critical of our system? Is it actually great in comparison to other democracies? Or could we take a look at another country and say, what, we could learn something from them?
We have real problems with our system.
We have what? Sorry, Alan?
Real problems. We are the world's longest running continuous democracy, and that's a great thing. But we are stuck with archaic 18th century institutions like the Electoral College. We have glory on our framers. But remember, half of them were from slave states. And the Electoral College is deeply tainted with slavery because the slave states would not tolerate popular voting for the president because the slaves would count for nothing. So we had the notorious 3/5 compromise, where slaves would count 3/5 for congressional and electoral college representation. So let's not celebrate the Electoral College. It greatly distorts what is the vote of the people. And frequently, we've had disparities. Now, what are some other countries, Scandinavian countries, do a couple of things that we should emulate? Number one, automatic registration. They automatically register all citizens when they turn of age. Number two, not have all of these restrictions that make it more difficult to vote. And number three, have popular voting. There are even some states, maybe not the Scandinavian ones, that even have compulsory voting. I'm not going for that, but I think we can learn a lot from
Wow,
other
interesting.
systems.
Mark,
So,
Liz?
I've worked in about 30 different countries over the years, and they only have need for polls when there's democracy. Otherwise, they don't need them. Look, I would not bash our system, to be honest. We have about 330 million people. We have 250 million people eligible to vote. We have about 150 million people now who are voting. The people who don't vote, you'd be surprised. The largest share of them are downscale white guys who just don't like politics or the system. You actually would not be happy, probably. I'm guessing if we had 100% of voting. I've worked in systems. I used to the Venezuelan democracy before it was taken over with model democracy. Millions of people used to come out to the rallies. I think the Indian democracy is functioning now. I think Britain you get 60% of the seats and you only get 34% of the vote. They don't redistrict the way we do. I mean, our system is meant to take into account the fact that they didn't want just people in a couple of states with population dominating. It was meant to balance the electoral college with the popular vote. If you look at the whole gerrymandering now, actually Democrats are doing a little bit more of it than Republicans, but you're within a percentage or two on these things. Either way, you're always within a percentage or two of the national vote and the congressional vote, and how it comes out, despite all of the fighting over the system. I wish we wouldn't drag our country down, to be honest.
I'll offer a different perspective. So I am British as well as American. For the purposes of now, you cannot tell because of my accent, but other times it's a little bit more visible. I've worked in electoral politics in both countries, and I can point out plenty of flaws with both systems and things that each does better than the other. But I think the common denominator there is when people say, okay, so you concept out something that's better than what we've got on the books. That's where it gets really quite tough, right? And we were confronted with that on the UK side of things. Interestingly, when it was down to the final two in the Conservative Party leadership election in 2022 to decide who the next prime minister would be, because for the first time, certainly in my lifetime, we actually had somebody likely to win who had been on record as opposing the monarchy, right? Like literally opposing the entire system. And that prompted a lot of discussions amongst Britons about, well, what do we think about that? And how should this actually look? And what should it be? What should the setup be? And I think what was very interesting to me is that even amongst people that I know, even amongst Brits who really do have a problem with the monarchy, it's awfully difficult when you ask people to sit down, even when you see something like the monarchy, which has some fairly obvious issues with it, to ask them to construct something that's better. And so I kind of tend to agree more with Mark that I don't think that there's as much wrong as people think is wrong. I think one thing we did phenomenally well in 2024, and actually I think, in our parliamentary elections earlier this year, also the UK did quite well, is increased voter participation, counting votes faster, getting the result done. Obviously, California is a laggard. I'd sure like to see them do something about that. But, I think when we're looking at what has changed between 2020 and now, one of the things that's happened is I think that in the US, I think there is more resilience in elections. I think there's more confidence in elections, and I think rightly so, because more people are in a position to participate. And the whole process is functioning more smoothly. So, is it perfect? No, it's not. None of these things are perfect. But would I say that I think, British democracy and American democracy, which are both quite different, do I think that they're both in a better position than they were, 20 years ago? Well, yeah, for sure. No, totally.
Yeah.
I do. So I guess I choose to see the positive in that and look on the upside.
The last presidential election, the big issue was counting mail-in absentee ballots. The argument was, well, the absentee ballot was a quirky thing that only worked for the military and for expatriates. It only usually dealt with a couple million, millions, how many, not just millions. Instead, half the country in 2000, half the country voted. Let me tell you both something that you may or may not be surprised. I got 2 ballots in the mail. I got one that said Thane Rosenbaum. You had 2, Mark? Mine said Thane Rosenbaum military, and then there was Thane Rosenbaum not military. And so I called up the local thing and I said, you know what? I really respect people that fight in the military, and I didn't. And I'm not comfortable filling out a ballot that says that I'm military. And they said, well, we just send that out because that's the ballots that were built. They were set up for people to be. So we were clearly not ready for prime time 4 years ago in doing this. But do you both think, I think we just lost Allan somewhere. Do you both think that we did much better overall in the counting, the speed with which we counted, the accuracy with which we counted, with the exception of maybe some questions of Pennsylvania? Is absentee mail balloting here to stay, or 4 years ago, we were told, certainly if you were watching conservative media, we would say, this is ridiculous. You should be able to get in your car with your driver's license ID and drive to your precinct. For God's sakes, get in line like a person and show your face and show your ID. I'm wondering, is that old school gone? Was that a better system because you actually had to do something to get to vote? To exercise your franchise, you had to put some hustle into it.
Well, so first, let me just say, mail, MAIL, voting, is here to stay. I don't think there's any question about that. I've always had a plan for, like, you should be able to go up to your ATM and vote, that it was already a security system.
You're already there.
But you see what happened. Let me tell you about the math of mail-in voting. If people vote by mail, let's say there are 100 voters and 50 vote by mail, those votes are done. They're counted. If there's 50 that have to show up on election day, 50 don't show up, 45 show up because their kid gets sick, their car breaks down, the weather's bad. So what happened in the prior 2 elections was Democrats banked all their votes in the mail, and Republicans lost about 2 percentage points because the fall off affected them differentially. In this election, they got rid of that. Now you're not going to find the Democrats caring about mail-in votes anymore because there's no partisan impact anymore. But there was a partisan impact for 2 elections that probably better, if you run the math of what I did, probably benefited the Democrats to 2 points. And that got virtually eliminated this election, which is good, because the problem is when you introduce a change and it benefits one party or another, as opposed to being an actual change that is just meant to do good and make it, better for everybody to vote. I think now mail-in voting is going to be good. It facilitates people. And finally, I would say, the one hesitation I have is voting is not meant to be, hey, let me catch you on the street corner, vote and be done. It is meant to be a serious, civic duty. And a little bit of that goes away the easier we make it and the more we let people harvest ballots. So I don't really like ballot harvesting. I hope that gets eliminated. I like mail-in voting because it broadened participation. And there still are about 90 million people who refuse to participate in our system. And they don't do it, and it's really kind of fascinating that they hang back.
Liz, I want you to answer this, but I wanted to throw in something that Mark didn't say. What about the mobile drop-off situation? Because we saw some of those boxes set on fire. I think it was in Oregon or Washington, right? So there's another example, like, well, we really think there's a chain of custody issue here. Like who you giving your ballot to? Harvesting sounded always weird, but even the mobile drop-off things now seem to be vulnerable. I wonder, Liz, whether you think, since again you were younger on this panel, on this discussion, and you're a social media online specialist, whether you think there may be a way to do this online, which completely makes it simpler than anything. Does any country do that?
Not that I'm familiar with. If they do, they don't do it probably nearly well enough for me to feel like we should replicate it. There definitely are people who have sort of pioneered experiments in this within the US. There are many state officials who have expressed interest in it, bipartisan secretaries of state. I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea. I think you have to be very careful about who your vendor is, and you have to be super careful about cybersecurity. And that's something that I think when you look at a wide array of data breaches and hacks that have affected everything from the biggest companies to, yes, everybody in the entire US government, that is definitely something that's going to give a lot of people pause. What I would say is, I think, ultimately what we keep and what we get rid of, people have to make a decision about what is more important to them. Maximal democratic participation in getting those voting numbers up, or having an appropriate number or an appropriately high number of people who are voting, but also in a way that people are properly engaged in the process. And it's not like, hey, do you want a free sticker? Yeah, I want a free sticker. Simple as that, right? And I don't have a particular answer to that. I mean, candidly, I'll say, sure, this time around, if the Republican ticket had been Rand Paul and Jeff Flake, and one of those systems had benefited them and the other one hadn't, I mean, clearly I'd be for the system that had benefited them. I'll cop to that. But I think in general, we are having to adapt to all of these innovations and changes. I think as far as mail voting, again, MAIL voting, I think we've gotten to a place where you're doing it much better, certainly, than what we did in 2020. I mean, we weren't in a situation where there was nearly the amount of discussion or debate about what the actual outcome would look like in Pennsylvania or Arizona, I would hasten to point out. I mean, Arizona, people forget it took a while in 2020, but also, I mean, anybody remember Kirsten Sinema's race? I mean,
Yeah.
God, that went on for absolutely
Yeah.
forever. And, I know people who were in Arizona kept running the numbers and were like, there's just no way she isn't winning this race. But like, it took so long from when people were saying that until when we actually got the result. So I do feel better about where we are now. And I think people are sort of adapting and evolving. Where it should go from here, I don't know if I have any particularly strong views about it,
Okay.
but I do think this election went pretty well. I think it's nice that the way that it was done, I don't want to say nice is not a great choice of word, but I think it's helpful that the way that this was done engendered more trust from more people across the ideological and philosophical spectrum. I think that there's generally more buy-in. And at the end of the day, I was going to be unhappy with any outcome of this election. I didn't vote for either ticket. I was never going to vote for either ticket. But I think that it is helpful that we've ended up in a place where there's a great deal more sort of cohesion and consensus about what the result was than what we saw in 2020, what we saw in 2016, what I remember from 2004. So I think generally we're going in the right direction. And I think
All right.
that's what everybody should focus on and embrace.
Two last questions. We'll say goodnight quickly. The first question is, Taylor Swift was the biggest act for sure, the Eras Tour. All over the world. I was in Poland this summer. They had 3 nights in Warsaw. They had to cancel the ones in Vienna. I mean, really was a phenomenon, right? Didn't make a difference for Kamala Harris that she got that endorsement. Barack Obama, everyone still says, is a political rock star. I don't know if Mark Penn, who was very much responsible for that label that was used for Bill Clinton during the Bill Clinton era, people like Mark Penn made Americans thought the most talented politician of his generation. Mark, did you come up with that line? But that was a great way. People always said the most talented politician of his generation. I always assumed you were part of that thinking. Obviously, Clinton, Obama, you would think that the amount of influence there, and since, as Allan said, it was still, or maybe it was Mark said, it was still a relatively close election. Did it make a difference at all? Or you're saying, in fact, without those endorsements, she would have polled more, she would have had fewer votes?
Well, I mean, I would say, and again, if you listen to my general message that substance matters, well, you know, what does Taylor Swift have to do with the price of eggs? Okay. And I think this was a rejection of and the celebrity endorsements, and I cringed in 2016 and 20. The Democrats, you know, got to throw those overboard because as much as people like the celebrities are the epitome of people who live in an environment, a Disney-like make-believe environment, you know, who's headlined by people like Diddy Combs, right?
Right.
And so the idea that you bring Hollywood into the campaign, other than to like get people to show up at a rally, that you think they're just not going to vote on.
Yeah, but you know, Alan's not here with us, Mark. But wasn't Sinatra helpful? Sinatra and his buddies in the Rat Pack to getting Kennedy elected? Marilyn Monroe, they all showed up.
Again, was it the, you know, look, there were a lot of reasons why John F. Kennedy was an amazing candidate and president. That, you know, did
And
Frank
he
Sinatra
didn't
help
need
many more?
Sinatra or
Right.
Marilyn Monroe did not have to sing happy birthday for him. Right.
If she had, I mean, you know, talk about somebody who was unbelievably spectacular as a politician, it was John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
Right? An incredible understanding of the issues and the substance of the world.
Yeah.
Listen to the Kennedy-Nixon debates.
I know.
The opposite of the joke debates.
I know.
We
I thought about that all the time. You know, they always say, you know, Nixon was pasty faced and he was sweating, you know, but he was really smart and articulate. It was a really, you know, it really was a real debate. And it's hard to believe that it was that Kennedy had a tan and that Nixon was sweating, because in fact, they were both really brilliant in many ways. Liz, do you have anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. I mean,
Yeah,
I think what I actually wrote a Substack piece about Taylor Swift and what the effect of that would be. I think my core takeaway on that, a couple things. First of all, a crap ton of Swifties are not actually American voters, right? They may not be. I know that there was this reported spike in registered voters as a result of it, but a lot of these people, like if you actually go around and you look, as I did for writing this piece, you try to seek out top Taylor Swiftie accounts so that you can interview these people. Like I think something like 8 out of 10 are like not even American. So
really,
that's important. Yeah. So I think that's important to bear in mind. I think it's also important to bear in mind that a lot of the people who are Swifties are 8-year-old girls. Or, you know, my son likes a good Taylor Swift dance party, whatever, but like he's 10, he doesn't get to vote, right? So, you know, it's possible that some of the people who were more influenced by the endorsement weren't even eligible in the first place.
Good point.
I think also with regard to Obama, and then I'll circle back with celebrities broadly, the trouble with Barack Obama has always been that people love him, but he has no coattails. And you saw this in election after election when he was president and when he was nominee. He cannot drag people over the finish line, whereas Donald Trump can. He doesn't always drag people over the finish line, but he can. And that's what we see with some of these Senate results this time around. Obama's just not great at that. He's really good at getting people to split their ticket and vote for him and then carry on Republican right down the rest of the line. And I think, you know, now we just have another data point to show that. I think on the celebrities point more broadly, yeah, I mean, I think Mark has a point that these are people who everybody knows ultimately, no matter how bad stuff gets in this country, they can buy their way out of any problem, right? So that does limit how much people are going to listen to them inherently. But the other thing that I've been really interested to see after the election is, you know, we had this perception that Trump, everybody who was endorsing Trump, and we had this the same, everybody who spoke at the 2020 convention, it was like they were basically all on payroll, right? There were a couple of people who weren't, but mostly they were on payroll. And it looked very sort of astroturfed and bought. But what's interesting is in the aftermath of the Harris campaign, I'm not saying the reason Oprah endorsed Kamala Harris was because of like, you know, the payment to the production company for the very expensive interview. But wow, did it sure read to a lot of people. I mean, we know this now in hindsight, but at the time, there were a lot of people who were like, something about this feels just a little cooked up and a little bit fake. Like it doesn't feel like she did it because her heart was in it. And it turns out maybe there was a small dose of that. Maybe it wasn't quite as authentic and genuine as it appeared. And if it had been, I don't know, that might have been different. But again, you know, going back to, I think what Allan would say if he were still here with us, this was a very close election. I am disinclined to be the person who says, oh my God, Harris screwed all of these things up. I actually think she did a pretty good job in circumstances where actually, when she entered the race, I considered it about 80% likely that he was going to win and she was going to get her clock cleaned, right? So, you know, I'm disinclined to criticize too much on that, but I'm not sure that celebrity endorsements get you a lot for all of these aforementioned reasons.
Mark, I will give you the last word and we'll say goodnight to the audience. And Liz said the word coattails on Obama. Do you expect Trump to have coattails on the midterms in 2 years?
Well, first of all, let me just say former presidents are loved because they're out of politics and not when they come back into politics.
I see.
Trump here does have a mandate, and the question is, will he do what Biden did and what Obama did before him, as opposed to what we did in Clinton, or really what Reagan did? If you look at the two presidents that really came out with job approvals in the 70s at the end of their term, Reagan and Clinton were really the two. And then if you look at the others who came in and said that they were going to change things, they were going to bring the country together, they were going to unify it, and then split up the country, they left the presidency with a divided country, which is where we are now. Trump will not have an election. Will he end the wars? Will he get the economy on track? Will he cut government spending? Will he close the border? Will he do the things that he said he was going to do? Or will he go too far, right? And if he goes too far, the same thing will happen to him that happens to everybody who else went too far. And Biden, in many ways, got a mandate to unify the country and bring it together. And he sure didn't do that when you look 4 years later at the country. So that's the challenge. What will Trump do? I have, frankly, no idea. Other than that, it is a serious presidency with serious issues. And people have to realize that he has a serious reform agenda that he is planning to execute here with this group. In a way, in 2016, he was totally ill-equipped. He had no idea what was going to hit him. He had basically nobody around him. And that is a dramatically different situation you see here. And either he is going to bring the Democrats back into power in 2020 or do the opposite. And that book is not written.
Great night. Thank you both. Mark Penn, Liz Mair. For the audience, please go to the 92Y website. We've got incredible amounts of new conversations coming up. FOLCS.org. We're partners with, longtime partners with the 92Y, but FOLCS.org also has our own. Go to our own website and you'll see the events that we both do jointly with the Y and on our own. For both of you, I want to thank you both. And also we lost Allan, but this was an incredibly stimulating, illuminating conversation, entertaining. Thanks for joining us for this. We're very grateful to see you, and we'll both be watching cable news, looking out for your faces and your voices. Thank you both, Mark and Liz. I'm Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS in the 92Y series. Thank you.
Thank you.